Hi, my name is Harry. I work for JZ Microphones. Welcome back. This week we're going to talk about the recent blog post that I wrote, which is all about phase relationship on drums. Now, phase is the hardest thing to get right and is the biggest question when you're trying to get your sound to sound like the references that you love and the things that you like listening to. And it's the answer to the question, why don't my drums sound as good as these? Any source that has multiple microphones on it is by nature going to be much harder to get everything in phase. First of all, let's talk about what phase actually is. If you look on my screen at the moment, you can see the waveforms are going in the same pattern as each other, i.e. when the first node goes up and the peak of that bell is up at the top, then the left hand side and the right hand side are both going up at the same time. If it was out of phase, then these would either be far away from each other or they would be opposing each other, where one goes up and one goes the opposite way. When it's out of phase, you get problems with things like the low end sounding weird and woofy. The snare just doesn't have that body that you need. The cymbals especially can sometimes feel like they're rotating around your head, especially if you're mixing on headphones. The best way to go about this with overheads is actually something called the 4-foot rule. Now, the 4-foot rule, as you can see in these clips, is where you have 4 foot away from the snare and 4 foot away from each one of the capsules of the microphone. You want to be measuring up from the center of the snare up towards the actual center of the capsule as well. You don't want to be measuring to a point on the microphone, like on the body. You want to be measuring to the actual capsule. This way you have perfect phase relationship between the loudest part on the actual kit, which is usually the snare. Kick drum is also one of those things that gets very much overlooked, especially in terms of phase. It's quite easy to overlook it because you can just kind of put 2 mics on there and be done, especially if you are miking up with 2 mics and you just want to get the sound of a kick drum. That's usually the hardest part in and of itself. But the distance between the inside microphone for the kick drum and the outside microphone for the kick drum can actually be quite substantial. As you can see in these clips, I've actually got my inner microphone much closer to the beater, about midway through the kick drum, and the outside I'm using the vintage 67, and it's roughly about 3 inches away from the outside skin, so I can get a lot more of that body, and I'm trying to use proximity effect to my advantage, but there's still roughly about a foot of distance between those 2 capsules. We then have to match that up in the box. So without further ado, let's dive in and have a little closer look. Let's start off with overhead, shall we? I've actually brought up a session from what me and my friend Ryan have been doing, and it's one of his favourite songs. We've just been, utilising the drum mics that we have here, so we could show you an example of the best way to go about the 4-foot rule and why it is so integral to my process especially. So I've got here the overheads out of phase on purpose, no processing or anything like that going on at the moment, and I just want you to listen to the body and where the placement of the snare actually is in regards to your stereo field. For me, it feels like it's out the back of my headphones and not dead center where it and the kick should be. So I'm going to play it now, and I'm going to flip the phase back into phase, and hopefully you'll be able to hear what I'm talking about. Hopefully you can hear what I'm talking about there, with the body of the snare and the actual placement of it doesn't feel like it's central. The same goes for the kick. The cymbals almost feel like there's more weight on one side than the other. So it's really good to get this right at the source. So the 4-foot rule is a really good way to do that. Kick drum's one of those ones that a lot of people forget about in terms of phase. The distance between the inside mic and the outside mic can sometimes be quite substantial. In this case, it's almost a foot. It's anywhere between 10 to 12 inches. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the inside mic, so I do a little bit of sample replacement or sample reinforcement. It's not a huge amount, it's only about 30%. The outside kick mic, I've only done around about 10% because I love the sound of the vintage 67 on the outside of the kick. So what you're hearing is majoritively the source tones straight from the kick. So with regards to this, I've made it so that it's actually in phase, and then I'm going to switch it out of phase, and hopefully you hear the subharmonic content and the low end resonance of the kick drum just fall away, and it almost sounds hollow in its timbre. As you can hear, there's this punch and this body that just gets erased immediately as soon as the phase is inverted. All I'm doing here to actually fix the phase issues is invert the phase on the polarity switch on each one of the channels within my DAW. However, you can do this on your preamp, or you can go simply into the waveform over here, and as you look in on this waveform, you can see that this node here, as it rises, the opposite side on the inside kick drum also lowers. So those are opposing each other, and actually the energy is cancelling each other out on those frequencies, which is why they disappear. In order to get those into phase without using the polarity invert, then all you can do is drag these back and match them up. I prefer not to do this, and because it's near perfectly out of phase, switching the polarity invert switch on the channel just makes my life a lot easier. Plus it also means I avoid anything like flamming, which is essentially where there's two sounds very quickly but out of sync. Imagine hitting the snare with two sticks. They're not going to hit at the same time, but it sounds like that but across the board, especially when you start to dial in the overheads as well as the kick drum mics, as well as everything else. What I didn't talk about in the blog post was actually the fact that I'm not using room mics in this mix. I've actually created my own room. Because my room is quite small in this setting, what I like to do here is just actually create what I call a faux room. On this mix, I'm using Brainworks rooms, BX rooms. It's just a simple room reverb, but making sure that everything's in phase is super imperative to making sure that this doesn't actually create more problems than it solves within the mix. If you have a listen to this, you can hear that I've dialed in a good amount of the overheads, but then I've also sent some of the kick in and out, one of the snare mics, and both the toms over to this channel. I've dialed in the level of what I want from the room. I like a room that carries the kick and carries the snare, and more than the toms, and definitely more than the cymbals, because I like my overheads to be the main port for my cymbals. But you should be able to hear a good reference if you're having trouble with recording a room at home. This should hopefully give you a workaround for that. So have a listen. Without any of the processing, this is actually what's being sent to that before it hits the reverb. As you can hear, it's much more of a lower sound. I've actually also tapered off some of the high end and the low end. We're using FabFilter's Pro Q3, just so that I can kind of tailor make it to as much of a room sound that I like for this mix especially. So hopefully that helps you with your next drum recording. If you need to refer back to it, the blog post has all the information that you'll need on this video as well. But until next time, stay creative, and I look forward to hearing your recordings.